Welcome to the Cannabis Cultivation and Science Podcast. I'm your host, Tad Hussey of KISS Organics. This is the podcast where we discuss the cutting edge of growing from a science-based perspective and draw on top experts from around the industry to share their wisdom and knowledge. Just a friendly reminder for folks who enjoy the podcast content and want to support our small company, we have a Patreon for the podcast where we do a book club, hangouts, and share private content that we don't share on social media. We also offer a wider range of products on our KISS Organics website, ranging from living soils, LED lighting, beneficial insects, organic fertilizers, and professional consulting. For this week's podcast, though, we are talking all about water. Dramm is an industry leader when it comes to equipment related to irrigation and horticulture. My guest this week is Les Evans. Les has a degree in biological engineering with a concentration in water, soil, and environmental engineering from NC State University and 29 years of industry experience helping growers of all types of crops with their environmental and water quality challenges. Les's day-to-day involves supporting the Dramm sales team and their customers with water treatment designs that maximize investment while minimizing environmental impact. When he's not at his desk, he can be found planting perennials with his family or running the NC Mountains to Sea Trail system, a stone's thrown away from his home in Raleigh. Now on to the show. Hey, Les, thanks for coming on the podcast. Appreciate it.
I am really happy to be here. Thanks for having me, Ted.
Yeah, you were actually the third Dramm person to come on the podcast. We were talking before the show, and you reminded me that Casey Schoenberg had been on the podcast talking about fish hydrolysate and how it's made, if folks want to go back and check that out. And then the wonderful Kurt Becker also came on and talked about all things water. So we're going to do a similar sort of style podcast today. I recently caught your webinar on dissolved oxygen, and I will link to that for folks who want to go on a deeper dive specifically into dissolved oxygen. We will talk about it today, but I really have just a random list of questions related to water that I think will be useful for growers to think about as they think about their water source. But can you tell me a little bit about yourself before we dive into the podcast?
Sure. Yeah. Entered the greenhouse and nursery space, now we call it CEA, in 1995 out of NC State University, biological engineer, water, soil, and environmental engineering concentration. Got really lucky, hired by a Swedish firm that is really involved in controlling the environment in greenhouses right out of school. And they sent me around the world, and I started seeing a lot of neat ways to grow plants, and have been in the industry just ever since. Been with Dramm for, I'd have to do the math, 12, 13, 14 years. You mentioned Kurt Becker and Casey. It's a neat team. Dramm does a great job. We're from all over the place in terms of backgrounds. And Dramm Water sort of officially became a thing. I'm making it up 10 years ago. And we started really putting water projects together. So my job at Dramm is sort of the lead designer. We have a lot of vendors, of course, that we work with, and we take a customer's new project or problem, specifically again in Dramm Water with their water and growing plants, and we put packages together for them that could look like a very complex system or hopefully a very simple system. Dissolved oxygen has become more of a topic every year. We've been learning a lot more about how important dissolved oxygen is in terms of growing a healthy plant. And so it's just something that we always are talking about, from, again, the most simple to most complex growing situations. Dissolved oxygen is something that just is not going away. And the more we learn about it, the more we realize how vital it can be to growing a efficient, healthy plant. So that's where we're at. And yeah, I'm glad you were able to see that webinar that the magazine hosted for us.
Yeah. So, and just a reminder for folks, if you are looking for a more complete engineering solution for your water in a commercial facility or greenhouse, Dramm is a wonderful resource for that. It is actually quite complex, the amount of variables and things that go into that sort of a system. So I can't recommend them enough. They also, since we're talking about a little bit about their products as a quick plug, they make these wonderful water breaker wands. That was, I think, where you started in the industry, as well as probably one of the best sprayers, commercial sprayers that I've ever seen, and a very cool nematode bucket that Suzanne absolutely loves. So they have a wide range of products that are definitely worth checking out. But even if you're not a commercial scale grower, a lot of what we're going to talk about today, I think will just apply to water in general. I even think about it in terms of a home grower. So let's just start with dissolved oxygen. Starting there, the big takeaways from your webinar on that was that raising dissolved oxygen led to much healthier plant outcomes. Can you kind of expand on that though in greater detail?
Yeah, absolutely. So generally, we are unable to apply as much dissolved oxygen as we're learning the plant would like to have. That's the bottom line. Rather, if it's the reservoir in my basement grow, or a 100,000 gallon tank, or straight well water, or what have you, it's just we aren't providing that root zone system and that plant enough dissolved oxygen to be in its happy place. Is kind of how I think about it. And the more we learn about its happy place, the more complex it gets. But it boils down to a lot of symbiotic things working well together to efficiently do what we also want to happen, which is to have a healthy plant grow as much flower or fruit or color or whatever we're wanting that plant to do as possible. And so dissolved oxygen is something that is part of every conversation we have. Sometimes we aren't doing anything to manipulate it because we might have enough. But again, it's generally we're talking about ways of even keeping what we did start with in the water longer and getting it to the actual crop. And a lot of times it's mechanically adding it to a system to be able to get it to the crop. But like you said, it can be, it's just a lot of conversations and understanding what we're growing, what the media is, what fertilizer regime you are. Are you organic? Are you salts? Are you combination? So all of this, again, it's a conversation to understand. But we know that dissolved oxygen as an input should not be ignored, right? So we're looking at all these other things that we're applying, that we're doing to grow our plant. Let's not ignore dissolved oxygen.
Now, if I have a reservoir, it's very simple to add a bubbler, and that will get me to sort of a ambient level of dissolved oxygen, potentially. And then there are ways to super saturate the water. Can you touch on what that technology looks like?
Perfect. I can geek out on the reservoir, increasing dissolved oxygen, and not shooting ourselves in the foot in doing so. I've learned from a lot of the best and a lot of colleagues and a lot of friends in terms of, and the smaller the reservoir, the harder it can be to not shoot yourself in the foot. Bottom line is we don't want to overheat the water by putting a nice, even if it's a really high-end aeration stone in the bottom of a 20-gallon res. We might be increasing the temperature dramatically, and that causes other issues. And it becomes a lot harder to keep any dissolved oxygen in that water if we've increased the temperature of that water. And so be careful. What we like to do is pick an appropriate technology. And now there's just, like you said, some wonderfully simple things to do. And then if we can stir the water, it might be our classic dropping a fish, little 2-gallon a minute fish pump in my small reservoir. Or I might use fancy mass transfer nozzles in a 10,000-gallon tank, but we're stirring the water to keep that dissolved oxygen in solution longer. We're not mixing or bubbling the water. That's just going to raise it to the surface inappropriately. If we have made true dissolved oxygen, we can keep it in the water longer. So again, depending on the vessel, if we do have storage, again, from a 25-gallon reservoir to a 5,000-gallon or 50,000-gallon tank, there's different methodologies in adding and keeping the dissolved oxygen in solution. So that's a really fun conversation. Again, whether it be just a home grower with or a commercial grower, we're going to look at different ways of enhancing or just keeping what we can in solution.
So temperature plays a big role in terms of the water's capacity to retain oxygen. As the water gets
Absolutely.
warmer, it can't hold as much. I'm also thinking though we have to water with water that's temperature appropriate for the crop that we're growing. We don't want to water with 50-degree temperature water. So what does that balance look like?
Yep. So you're right. We're generally aiming for industry standards 68, 70 degrees Fahrenheit, right? That's our general happy place to not shock young root systems. Anything under, the plants can handle quite a lot, obviously, but we don't want to apply cold water to the younger the plant, the more detrimental it can become. We've lots of studies out there. Cold water to a younger root system can really slow things down dramatically. A few hours of really cold water, we've seen affect even a vigorous cannabis species. It can slow it down by many days, if not weeks. So those are interesting studies to go and look. So really,
Wow.
really pay more attention. I'm the dissolved oxygen guy, sort of, or one of many, but pay very much attention to not applying too cold a water. If you're nice buffered, big living soil environment, it's kind of got its own warmth, so to speak. It's going to not matter so much. But if you're a hydroponic grower, if you're growing in stones, if you just have a more less media-free environment, that water temperature is really affecting. And the younger, we're trying to grow those root hairs, we're trying to do all these processes. And if it's too cold, things are just thinking, oh, I got to go into dormant. I'm getting ready for something, but it's not fruiting, right? It's the opposite. So just think about the seasonal changes. So again, I digress, but the colder the water, we can hold more dissolved oxygen. Well, let's make it really cold so I can get more dissolved oxygen. No, there is that fine line that you just mentioned. We're aiming for mid 60s, mid 70s is the happy place. And we can put in 5, 6, 7, 8 parts per million of dissolved oxygen within that temperature. Can we get it to the crop? And again, what else is in the water? What's going to steal from the oxygen that we're trying to create? The biofilms, the just goo, some of our soils, we're adding dissolved oxygen. Let's get it to the beneficial microbes. Let's get it to the appropriate things in the rhizosphere before it gets stolen in the piping system. Or just, again, high temperature is bad. It's going to come out of solution really quickly. We can't hold as much. Too cold has its own problems. So there's that happy medium when applying it to plants.
Yeah, one question I asked you off air that I was curious about is what DO levels are we getting using a Dramm water breaker watering head? Because in my brain, I figured there's got to be some DO getting added just from the mechanism of the way the water is being split into such small particles. But maybe I'm totally wrong. What are your thoughts around something like that?
And my answer was, I think if we start at zero, if we have just well water or a municipal water coming right out of the spigot, right out of our faucet, and it's near zero, probably, we might be lucky and have a couple parts per million. That's still not a good level of oxygen, right? So we're going to get things happening in reverse. If we apply anoxic or hypoxic water to a root system, things are going to go in reverse, right? We're stealing oxygen out of the plant because of osmosis properties, right? So we've got to make sure we get that minimum when we say 5 parts per million. Does a water breaker help? It has to do with so many things. There's so many different flavors of water breaker. If you haven't been to a garden center, and seen the Dramm water breakers, typically on the retail side, and what we see at home grows is the 400 hole water breaker, the original aluminum one you can still buy. It's a nice beefy one you can drag around on the concrete. It's not going to get hurt. There's the plastic ones, but they have 400 holes. You can purchase 1,000 holes. Generally, the idea for the water breaker was to break up the water, to soften the water, to not compact the top layer of the soil, in which helps us have a more porous soil, which allows more oxygen to do what it needs to do in the root zone. So the original idea was not to probably add dissolved oxygen via the water breaking mechanism of a Dramm water breaker or anybody's water breaker.
Mm-hmm.
But I think that you're right. It's got to increase it. If we started at 0, I think it's going to help. If I happen to supply 10 parts per million of DO, I might lose dissolved oxygen because it's smashing against the screen, and now it's introducing it to a lower environment. So it's going to try to reach equilibrium. So if I came at it with a real high, like if I'm got a Dramm water system and I've got 30 parts per million in my reservoir, and then I'm spraying it out of my hose, it's going to actually decrease it. Versus if you can imagine a spaghetti tube, drip irrigation right to the soil, we have 30 parts per million in the tank. And a lot of that, if not most of that, depending on distances and elbows and stuff, a drip emitter is going to get right to the crop, right down into it if it's a stake or a weight or however we're doing. Versus hand watering, we're actually going to get rid of all of that. That 30 ppm of dissolved oxygen out of a Dramm water breaker, it softens the water. It feels great. We're not we're not smashing our soil everywhere, but we're actually going to be taking 30 and knocking it down hard because of the pressure change. So another thing that takes gases, dissolved oxygen out of water is a pressure change, right? So that we're battling pressure changes also. High temperature, pressure changes, two things that are going to take dissolved oxygen out of the water. So it's a neat conversation. And I mentioned the screen air, I think is the name of it, is actually meant to, it's a very expensive water breaker for larger pots that are going to have longer grow times. And it just really softens the water. It's got inputs on the top of the nozzle to allow air in as that stream comes through. So we're kind of infusing more air than we ever would in a normal water breaker. But the screen air, Dramm screen air, is a neat, funny thing for generally much larger pots in your outdoor grows. That's definitely helping, taking well water generally in a big field of hemp or cannabis, especially, that it's going to be out there all season. So could talk about water breakers for hours.
Now, when we water with any type of water, regardless of the DO level, we're also pushing oxygen as a physical mechanism of that water, pushing oxygen down into the soil as well, correct?
Right. So depending on what that soil looks like, if you have DO in your water, and again, depending on if we can get dissolved oxygen to the surface or even subsurface, lots of sub-irrigation out there, obviously. So again, depending on how we're applying the water, there's so many factors, what is it, clear water that we're applying to a living soil? Is it fertilized water with just salts, or have we added things to it? So again, depending on how we've made the dissolved oxygen and what form it's in, is it truly dissolved? Is it soluble in the water? And then how we're applying it to the crop. But if we're just hand watering it onto the surface, that's probably an inefficient way, honestly. If we've made a lot of dissolved oxygen, I'd do whatever I could to sort of get it smoothly, we say laminar flow through a hose, and then gently onto it. It's going to keep the oxygen in solution longer than a water breaker would. So be cognizant of what you're using a water breaker to do. Obviously, it's a wonderful watering tool, and it's there for a big reason. But we don't want to shoot ourselves in the foot.
Yeah. So what options do I have in a scenario like here at my house? I'm using essentially a drip irrigation system directly from my hose, which is hooked up to a municipal water supply. How can I address dissolved oxygen in a situation like this where I don't have a reservoir? Or are there any affordable options for growers like myself in this scenario?
Great question. Very difficult. So Venturi injectors, and I don't think we make it anymore, but it was a really neat tool, the Siphon Inject. There are others out there. It is a venturi injector that is just pulling air. If you're leaving the tube out of, usually it was used to put a nutrient, knock the pH down. You would put it in your bucket and it just had a tube and it's just using the water flow across it. But we could use it to introduce atmospheric air has 21% oxygen, right? Let's not forget. And so it is urine the most common and trickiest way. If you don't have a reservoir, if you aren't refilling a reservoir, and then utilizing that for watering. I'm in a prohibition state, so I'm going to state that in my perpetual tomato garden, I have a reservoir and it refills and I add oxygen to it and I use a sub-irrigation platform that it's super easy. And when I was traveling a lot, I could rely on things to keep happening when I needed to leave. But I had 0 parts per million DO and it worried me just because I was going to be pulling from and especially in sub-irrigation where it's just sort of using that water as it needs to. The little valve opens and it's cool. It's an easy way with the living soil to grow, my tomatoes really efficiently. But I had it hooked up like you did, and I just felt like I was adding probably some inappropriate things, even if I was using one of those RV carbon filters, which I really enjoyed. It was doing a pretty good job, good for a few thousand gallons. So to answer your question is maybe venturi injection, but could be tricky. And I'm going to think on that one because it's something that we get asked a lot. It's just really the media, the porosity of your media. Make sure that if you're using soils over and over again, that you are making sure it's been well, blended and do all those things that you guys teach us about in terms of soil health. But it's really making sure that we have air spaces in there to allow natural things to happen and that we do not overwater. Underwatering, bad. Overwatering, of course, just as bad. And so we try to teach, especially new production cannabis growers, to be drier growers, right? Don't just irrigate for the sake of irrigation. Let's look at the moisture level, depending on your media. Let's make sure that we are not. It's generally an over irrigation problem, and that's bad for a number of reasons. In a home grow, you're not worried about wasting a few dollars worth of nutrients or organics, but the larger a facility, that becomes a big issue. But it's just you start chasing your tail if you're over irrigating. In terms of the media saturation and porosity and available oxygen.
I find with folks switching from a more traditional hydroponic or chemical growing mineral salt environment to growing with living soils, they actually tend to underwater because they're used to these pretty big drybacks. So I'm coming at it from a different perspective, interestingly enough. Yes, overwatering leads to root hair death, which will cause a lot of the same issues as underwatering, and is potentially just as awful. I will say you're opening yourself up to more root diseases like fusarium, pythium, things like that. And that's a big reason not to overwater. And I was actually just having a conversation. I'm not a huge fan of sub-irrigation. But if you're a new grower, I think it's an excellent option. Or like in your case, where you're having to leave for a while, it's a wonderful tool to keep from avoiding these massive fluctuations in hydrology that cause these problems. So
it allowed us non-professional green thumb folks. It allows you to get by really well. But it is not steerable in any sort of way. Now we have massive production, and I've been involved with flood floors since forever ago. Flood benches, flood floors have been a large component of, large scale commercial horticulture, from ornamentals to vegetables, et cetera, of course. So we do know that it can be very, very effective, depending on the crop and all of these things, but you've got to know what you're doing. And again, it's just tougher to steer a crop, like you said. So there's goods and bads, depending on what you're trying to accomplish. 100% agree.
All right. Well, let's move on from dissolved oxygen. You've definitely got me thinking though, and I'm going to look into now adding a carbon filter. We'll talk a little bit more about filtration. but
Yeah.
also a Venturi injector sort of into my system before it gets to irrigation, and just see. I'll have to see what I can do. I used to have a DO
There's
meter. I'll have to track that down.
there's little levels, and I worked for Biotherm. If you know the Biotherm guys, I was there for 9 years working for them. They have the O2 tube, and not to plug a company, but we use their DOS X series, which is diffusion, which is mass transfer gas infusion, in this case oxygen. So they have small systems, for real small hobby sized grows to really do an impressive job. I don't know how small they go though. So that's a product that came on board
Cool.
a lot later after I left working for them. But again, there's companies out there that you can go and research. And I think it'd be fun to incorporate. I would carbon filter it. We'll talk about that before you spend the money to infuse any oxygen into it. But
Great.
yep.
So, like I said, we're going to jump around. I want to cover a lot of questions that people just have that are just really general questions about water. So let's start off talking about the differences between chlorine and chloramine for people that are on
Oof.
municipal water.
Great question. I am not the PhD on this subject, but have had to be the what's that commercial? I stayed at a Holiday Inn Express last night. If you're familiar, like all of a sudden you sort of, oh well, but on that one I'm an expert. Um, anyway, the chlorine has been traditionally used as an oxidizer, an effective oxidizer. Chlorine, as we all know, has been used in pools and in municipal water treatment plants for eons. It does what it does and generally becomes harmless if we are doing it correctly, which of course we have learned to do in our city municipal systems. What we've learned, not we, the water treatment folks have needed to get more residual. They've needed this disinfection power to last longer. Chlorine, again, has, its half-life is decent enough to do what it needs to do. And we probably aren't getting, I hope, a lot of free chlorine parts per million out of, your faucet. If you're smelling chlorine, I'd probably call, the city if I'm on a municipal system and you can smell chlorine like a swimming pool or something. That's probably not the levels you want coming into your home. Or certainly you'd need to consider trying to get rid of it in your home beforehand. So it's really trying to keep pipes clean. Chloramines were added again. They become trickier from what I've learned. And we had a quick chat about it before we started recording. Chloramines have been added, and they've been really added. We've seen since COVID. And so when they started testing the effluents going back into water treatment, they can study how, the COVID trends. I guess they started getting nervous and they started turning up the dial on a higher residual chloramine. Yep. And we saw certain municipal plants, and these are generally from Dramm Water working with cannabis facilities, new facilities, some of them smaller operations, other MSOs that had been burned in one state, and really with us taking a hard look at municipal, we started asking the municipal folks questions. If they are seasonally, municipal water has changed way more drastically than I've seen a well water on average, because they've had to, during the summer, the grows in the corridor of Michigan are pulling from the lake, and the water temperature increases, and the bad bacteria, because of the water temperature increasing from the lake, increases. So they have turned up the dial, literally variably turned up the dial and added chloramines to try to get rid of a higher BOD, biological or oxidative demand, the bad stuff they're trying to kill for longer. And that chloramine, that's what I feel is turning into things we really don't want. Again, chlorine, if done right, we aren't too worried about it. We haven't been. We've been drinking that water for decades and decades. But chloramines, to me, is still proof is not in the pudding. And I want to make sure I'm getting rid of them and asking more questions to my municipal treatment folks about their use of chloramines. So if that's the takeaway, it's learn if there's chloramines being added to your municipal water supply. And I'm not a conspiracy theorist or anything. I think we're doing everything we can very appropriately. It's just, what if that water's actually super clean and now the chloramines don't have anything to get it to get rid of it, right? It isn't doing its thing. It's still in the water supply. And we've seen chloramines come out into our irrigation water. It's just something I want to be sure to remove. And again, you might ask me about it, but filtering it out right off the get-go is generally a very inexpensive, great insurance policy. And everybody's pretty familiar with the carbon filtration. And so carbon media has changed a little bit over the years, and we can get into that. And it's become much more efficient. There's a question like on the questionnaire, are there chloramines? Yes. Well, then I'm going to make you spend a little more money on a different kind of carbon media. That's basically it. It's more efficient at absorbing those chloramines.
So I'm going to give you my very limited knowledge on chlorine and chloramine to try and simplify this for folks. And please correct me where you can at anything that I say.
We're learning from each other.
Yeah. As it's been explained to me over the years, because I've been hearing about chloramine for over a decade now, because they have it in, I think, Portland, Oregon, which is not too far away from us. I have chlorine here, and chlorine, like you said, pretty unstable chemical. It reacts with oxygen and organic matter, and the constituent remains is fairly safe, like you said. Chloramine, I thought, changed to chlorine, and I think ammonia was what I was reading recently about it.
Right.
Are sort of the constituent remains of what happens when it complexes or comes in contact with organic matter, biological, microbial life, something like that. Chlorine, very stable component. You can leave water out with chlorine in it. It will off gas over time, or you can bubble it to remove chlorine. Chloramine, that's not the case. It actually has to come in contact with something biological or some sort of organic matter, whether that be an old boot, a handful of soil. Carbon filtration is the simplest and easiest one. That's why you've got me thinking about a carbon filter. In general, I don't tend to worry about chlorine or chloramine relative to a lot of other things. It's pretty low on my list, primarily because I've always been under the assumption that my soil is so biologically active. It has such high levels of organic matter. I mean, much higher than even agricultural soils, to where what may potentially be dying is being replaced so rapidly. And, the level of chlorine is so low that I tend to be not too concerned about it. I haven't noticed any detrimental effects from watering with chlorinated water. But again, what you're bringing up, I think, is really interesting. I haven't thought about it post-COVID. I haven't had to deal with chloramines. I have heard you could use ascorbic acid also as a good solution, vitamin C potentially. And there's actually some commercial ascorbic acid products specifically for removing chlorine. I can't remember. I think it was called Vita Dechlor was a product we used back in the day. But yeah, that's sort of my take on it. I don't know how you feel. I assume too, if I'm watering with something like a water breaker, where that water is in such small particulates of finer droplet size, as that water is traveling through the air towards the soil, it's coming in contact with a ton of oxygen. I wonder how much chlorine is really even making it in the soil at that point. So
yeah,
those are all my thoughts.
I love it. We agree. I'm not overly worried about an appropriately chlorinated municipal water supply, and I am asking a lot more questions on chloramines if they are adding chloramine.
Okay.
And it feels like there's more flavors of chloramine than, again, you and I will learn together and find somebody that knows what's what, because I've heard the same thing. When in combination, chloramines and organic matter have created some really nasty things, it turns out. So I keep we'll have to go down that rabbit hole offline.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. If you do find some answers, please reach out.
Yeah.
Okay, talking about not so great things in water. Another question I had for you was PFAS or PFAs, those forever chemicals that you keep hearing about. I hear they're everywhere now. What's your experience or knowledge around dealing with this?
More personal than business, in terms of I haven't run up against anybody that was concerned about PFAS in their irrigation water or supply, but it has absolutely been a topic where I am. I'm sitting in Raleigh, North Carolina, and we have these forever chemical producing manufacturing plants within a couple hours drive of me. It has absolutely gotten into the water supply. It has been a problem for a long time. We keep learning more and more about these nasty things that are manufacturing, I forget, anti-flammable materials. It's a lot of chemistry, right? And they do not go anywhere ever, and they come into our bodies and they stay there, and they are very carcinogenic. So it's been a real mess. I would be working with some experts if somebody brought it as a potential contaminant in their water supply. I would really go somewhere quick that isn't just us making our best guesses and Googling. I'd want to reach out to people that really knew what they were talking about. My guess is it's probably not terribly difficult to get out of a water stream. The problem with these is that they have contaminated aquifers and the soils, etc. And when, it's just, they're part of the ecosystem.
Mm-hmm.
That's tough. Like if your well is contaminated, dig a deeper well, get a clean aquifer. I think is kind of what the sad reality is of me understanding if they're there, it's just tough to remediate them or get rid of them out of the environment that, once they're in there, they're just being recycled again and again and part of our water. So it would be something that I would not mess around with in terms of just assuming we could get rid of them with our typical methods, which we can get rid of some really nasty things with some pretty basic methods. You mentioned aeration to get rid of a lot of chlorine. There's all kinds of things that we can do simply, but these are a different beast. And that's why you are appropriately hypersensitive to them.
Yeah, let's jump into filtration really quick then. So can you touch on sort of what removes what? Like, obviously RO is, reverse osmosis is sort of like the best, the top of the line option for removal. No, you're saying no. I'm learning. Okay. It's in my head.
Don't call it the best.
Well, right? it has downsides for sure.
Right. It's going to get rid of a lot, most everything, whether you want it to or not.
Yeah.
So we don't just throw RO at a cannabis. We will have, okay, first give me RO. Why do you think you need RO? Right? Well, just that's what you do in cannabis. We grow with RO. Could we have a discussion about that? So we've become very aware that it's not something that should just automatically be part of, hey, I'm going to spend some real money on my facility or on my grow. RO. That's been the case. And we've seen it not just cannabis production, but in other sort of, especially in indoor growing. Let's just take whatever water it is, no matter how good or bad it is, and we're going to RO it. Well, let's just talk about that. RO is absolutely a really good tool at removing everything and starting from zero. Why would we do that in our industry if then we're going to add ppms back into it? Well, what if all those ppms most of them were fine, and you're stripping them all out, and now you're paying to add them back in the form of EC, right, and getting our parts per million back up? Well, why would we do that, right? So we just question. We use RO for salts, high chlorides, high bicarbonates, like these things you can't filter out, so to speak. You do have to use an RO membrane and RO to remove or reduce salts. So that's our stance. It is absolutely necessary when it is necessary, right? And can we blend back? Can we blend back this crop? And I'm growing in soil beds, in a living soil. I'm an organic grower. I just want to start with high quality water. Great. Then you can talk us into using more and more pure permeate, right? So RO makes permeate, and then it makes the reject water. We can blend back in. All of our systems have the ability, whether you think you're going to need it or not, to blend back in the untreated, maybe it's been carbon filtered and then not softened. So I'm blending my carbon filtered water that hasn't gone through the RO back in with my RO permeate at 0 to 50% more. that RO machine starts paying for itself a lot more if we don't have to use RO permeate. So it's rare that we're going to recommend RO permeate be used. It can be very aggressive water. It can pull nutrients out. It's trying to make itself whole. So there's lots of bad things about pure RO permeate, especially in young crops that are trying to, with super small root systems and fine hairs. It can be really it could slow things down, just like that cold water scenario I mentioned. So irrigation with pure RO permeate, you really got to know what you're doing. Again, it's just trying to make itself whole. So that's RO is the extreme, right? So I can talk about normal.
So the original question I wanted to ask you though was like, what does, like, for example, a simple carbon filter not remove?
Yep. Initially. Simple carbon filter cannot remove salts. Okay. Right. I don't care how fancy. There's catalytic, activated carbon, and now catalytic carbon. Two medias that are our go-to medias. Catalytic is just a little more efficient. It's a little more expensive, a little more efficient removing chloramines. It's just stickier. They're stickier sponges, essentially. But they cannot remove salts. That's its biggest thing. It can remove a lot of things. It can adsorb some levels of heavy metals, but if you have heavy metals, it's typically not the only filter we're going to look at. If man, I've got high levels of boron, barium, nickel, these things, some of it could be adsorbed by accident on purpose, but then we really would need to make sure we look at levels. And there's, again, certain heavy metals we can't.
So Les, can you clarify when you say salts that you're not just talking about sodium for folks that are listening, in case they're not familiar with the sort of the broader chemical salt term?
Yeah, salts can mean a lot of things. And when in the nursery and horticulture, we ask, are you a synthetic grower? You're growing with salts, right? I mean, salts are chlorides, potassiums, manganese. These are all types of salts, and we can't take those out with carbon filters. If you have way high levels of salts, or your water is hard, sodium bicarbonate, right? These are things we need to be aware of. And that's when we start looking at a salt removal machine, reverse osmosis, ultrafine filtration, but really to remove soluble salts, which again, right, not just sodium, but a whole strip of the periodic chart are essentially, we call them salts, and they become soluble in water. And we can't physically get rid of them. We have to do special things to remove salts.
So what would something like an ozone machine be used for, if we're talking about filtration?
Right. Not a filter. Yeah. Ozone is like, it's an oxidizer, disinfection, right? So chlorine dioxide, hydrogen peroxide, oxidizers we're using to disinfect the water. And so ozone, not necessarily a filter. It does almost always require some thought about pre-filtration and post-filtration. If we're using ozone as a disinfectant, ozone's super efficient. Again, if you go to the webinar, I get into it a little bit, but it's a really efficient way. If we needed its use for disinfecting and for precipitating out metals. So it's really powerful, and we can get rid of irons. We can get rid of these other, if we have high levels of metals, again, at the periodic chart, we've got metals, metal halides. Can we precipitate those out? We'd hate to have to inject a ton of chlorine, which is a way we would do so with small levels of iron. Ozone is so powerful and is so reactive. We can harness its powerful oxidizing power to precipitate out metals. So
you get like iron
it's not
oxide,
filtering it out.
Is that what you're saying?
We're removing the iron, precipitating it out, and then we have to filter it out. Otherwise, we're going to have, its precipitate clog up anyway. But at least the iron, we get it out of solution. So you either use, there's multiple ways of removing high iron, which is a problem all around the country with wells. And we've always seen that some of us have the orange stain in our well water. That's iron, typically soluble iron. And we're trying to desolubilize it and capture it. We have to filter that out though. But ozone, not necessarily a filter, but it can be part of a filtration system, if that makes sense.
Great. Are there any other major ways of filtering water, or I guess we touched on disinfecting with ozone, but besides carbon and RO?
I like to break it into my simple brain into there's mechanical filtration. If I have particulate, if I have things floating in the water, that is a very different kind of filter than if I'm trying to remove some chemistry, right, out of the water. And by chemistry, we've talked about chlorine, chloramines, salts, right? That's part of the water chemistry. And I'm trying to alter or remove things that are too high of a level. So there's those kinds of filters that can do that. Carbon filtration happens to have those properties of being able to change the sort of chemistry of the water. Well, if I'm just trying to remove silt out of a well that's just got silty water that clogs up my micro irrigation, or it just really becomes a hindrance, and it's I'm trying to remove physical particulates, that's a whole different set of filters. And boy, are there a lot of those. Screen filters, media filters, sand filters are an old school media filter. So there's just all kinds of things. I just sort of, sometimes they're one and the same. A well can have it smells like rotten eggs. It's got high hydrogen sulfide. I need to remove that. And it's got silt. Great. Well, I need a physical filter, and then I need a sort of a chemical filter type system to change the water on two different levels, if that makes sense. So physical filtration in my mind, and sort of more of a chemical altering or removal filtration systems. Yeah.
So jumping back to straight RO water, and you brought up a great point. Like, people should absolutely test their water. Don't assume that you need RO. RO is not ideal. I've always heard RO referred to as hungry water because it wants to bond with various minerals and things. And so when you add it to your soil, or when it goes through a pump system, like you said, it could pick up things that we may not want to be adding to our water. And I think that's a good story on heavy metals that you shared with me, that let's get to here in a minute. But the quick question I had, because you already answered the question of why not do you straight RO, but what's a good target PPM, just broadly, possibly, that folks listening could aim for if they did need to use RO?
That's a terrible question, Ted.
Okay.
Because where did you start? Because if you started at an EC of 2.0, right, and I'm an EC guy, and tell me where your PPM is. You're trying to hit. What PPMs are you trying to hit? Give me in a vegetative state. Walk me through the PPMs, your averages that you like to see, that your crop enjoys. Give me those ranges so they're fresh in my mind. And then I have to go, and I would use a calculator, right? Because you guys come to us PPMs, and we talk about the makeup of an EC, and then we start parsing that out. So if I know that an EC of 1 to 2 is a heavy feed, and you go more than that, you know what I mean, in terms of that. And that 500 PPM is that.
So you're approaching this from the perspective of, I'm fertigating and I'm maintaining my mineral, my overall plant fertility through chemical fertilizers, and continually adding that level of small levels of fertility throughout the plant's life. I'm coming at it, and keep in mind, we get all types listening to this podcast, but I'm thinking of it like the majority of my fertility is already in my soil, because I'm 100%. An organic living soil guy. And so for me, I'm looking at the water purely for irrigation purposes.
Yes. So my question back at you is are any PPMs needed? I'd hate to say that RO water isn't going to hurt your crop that has all the PPM it needs in the soil, in your amendments, in that crop. So I guess I'm throwing the question back at you to teach me, what is the PPM makeup what is it made of? Because if it's harmful or adding salts or, something that if we're trying to cut the water, if I'm coming in with too high ppm, you're asking the question, where is that level? I can't answer that as an average, because you could have a hotter mix because you like to do it this way. I think, again, you're teaching me on the organics and living soil side of things, and I'm saying it might be very different for somebody who's just really trying to generally we're most all trying to create the same kind of product, right? And do it within that same time frame of this plant that is an annual in terms of cannabis. But I don't want to answer it if somebody's growing not cannabis or not tomatoes or not something that's fruiting, or if it's a longer term crop. Or we have customers that are growing cactus and propagating cactus, and I'd be like, man, they're air plants that are tons of folks that are, production, small, medium, and large of air plants, where we get closer and closer to 0 ppm required, needed. It cannot handle high levels at all if it's an air style bromeliads, orchids, right? So it's hard for me. I'm trying to wear your hat, but then the hat of 99 different other crops. But yes, in your world, I think to start with the water and look at the ppm of your municipal, let's just say a municipal source coming into your house, and then you're gardening with that municipal water. I want to take a look at it and go, are those ppms okay for you? It looks like you guys have pretty even the ppm makeup, because what makes up ppm it's like a soup. I could have added the soup has got the ppm, but my soup's I've got a chicken stock base. My wife's got the vegan thing going on over here, and our ppms are exactly the same, but they're completely made up differently. So I'd be afraid to add mine onto a certain kind of soil mix. Does that make sense? I'm not smart enough to know.
No, it does. It does.
Start.
I'm trying to simplify the question, and you're telling me
Yes.
it's too complicated. So you're saying, like, if we get the soil or the water, if we get the water down to 50 ppm, but that 50 ppm is all sodium, it may still be a problem. If that ppm is all calcium, then we just need to account for that, and it's perfectly fine in our fertility plan. So
absolutely, thank you. That is what I'm trying to get to, because we see people take out good things and add it back in. We see people very appropriately, on purpose, by accident, take out the bad things and then add their good things back in. We just need to start. So that ppm is a soup in my brain of could be anything. It's like, man, well, it's free calcium. Put 100, like, what's going to not harm your crop? Obviously, we don't want to have anything become toxic levels and build up over our life cycle, our crop. Again, or if we're growing trees or nurseries, wow, we've got to be really cognizant of a 50-year crop. If you can imagine, we have customers that they're growing nursery stock that's years. So
maybe a better question or approach then would be to say, okay, let's set targets for all of these bad actors, whether that's chlorides, bicarbonates, sodium, and say, when we hit that threshold, let's say we don't want to see more than, I'm going to make up a number here, 5 ppm of sodium overall in that RO water or in our remineralized water before at that point, we don't have to take action and we can feel comfortable using it as our irrigation water. But if that 50 ppm of total is as a total in my water is entirely comprised of sodium, then that may put us above our target threshold and we'd have problems still. But why is it so important that we remineralize water in this scenario? Because I do know of growers that water with straight RO in living soil systems. Like you said, it is more buffering. We don't see as many issues, but I feel like it's suboptimal for all the reasons. I feel like it is too.
I do too. And I don't want to be completely anecdotal or feel that way, but it is a hungry water. The chemistry is the chemistry. It is trying to make itself whole. And it is very aggressive, meaning it's going to pull and make it grab and break apart certain things that you might not want broken apart in terms of bonds. I don't think it's, pure permeate would be an interesting experiment to really take a look at it in terms of beneficial I don't think its properties would behoove the life cycle of a nematode, right? I can't imagine it increasing their life cycle. I feel like it would be harmful. I'm now just sort of coming up with things that we use, and we make sure that we have an appropriate media, and based on the media type, or right, if we keep, depending on if we're talking um, from hydroponics all the way to what you do and the organic side of things, I think RO obviously becomes nearly impossible to work with in hydroponics. If we do a lot of lettuce bath systems, like acres and acres of floating lettuce bath systems, 41 to 50 days crop cycles from seedlings to harvest at the other end of a big long greenhouse on these, really neat production facilities. And we have to really be careful. There's enough water there. We do have some buffer in the water, but it's purely hydroponic. So any change, right, we're on the razor's edge in pure hydroponics. And I think you get away with a lot more very positively in living soil and organic, because you have such a proliferation of all the beneficials, increasing the health of the crop, and really just becoming very powerful and watching out for the root system when you have the living soil. So it's a lot to talk about. So much going on.
That's actually a really good transition, because you mentioned how we have much better buffering capacity in living soils than with these other forms of growing. Yet I still believe that the pH of my water can matter. It doesn't always matter, but it can matter, specifically around this idea of alkalinity and hardness. So which relates to, and again, correct me on anything, it relates to the ability of the water to change that pH. So the buffering capacity of that water, or ability,
right.
Your ability to change the pH of that water. And so if your water has a very high EC, if it has a lot of alkalinity, it could impact the pH of your media. And yes, these microbes and the rhizosphere interactions there absolutely play a role in buffering that and transitioning it into a pH range that's going to be more optimal for the plant. But my perspective has always been, if we water with water that's been properly pHed, and assuming that the alkalinity is high and we need to adjust the pH. If it's low, rainwater, something like that, even if it's 8.2, I'm not that worried about it, because that pH can swing. Same with RO, low ppm RO water, I don't worry about pH. But if we can make water that has high in alkalinity into a better pH range, I would assume that would allow the plant to put its energy and those microbes in its energy into more efficient plant processes that would increase its health and growth. What are your thoughts around that?
Yes, it is easier to talk about in a soilless environment, because water chemistry is everything, right? The water, that's it. And like you just said, if we have zero buffer, zero alkalinity, things change immediately, right? And titration is how we test it. And I can barely remember, but you keep dropping drops into this water and nothing's changing. And then the next droplet, everything shifted, right? You got to the top and then it just plummeted, right? So it's just an interesting experiment in how quickly non-buffered water environment can change. And that's, like we call it, the razor's edge, right? If you're trying to steer a crop, if you're trying to utilize zero alkalinity water, pure RO permeate, right? You've stripped everything, and now it changes really quickly, depending. It can be very frustrating. The buffer you've provided in the media, in the soil, in the organic soil, is absolutely going to be a lot less dependent on hitting that pH just right, right? If we're a completely salt-based grower, synthetics, non-organic, production facility, that pH 5.8 to 6.0. And I mean, we want 5.85. We want 5. What do you want? What does this crop like? hydrangea in that peat media versus, I mean, it's just, exactly. We've dialed that in and we are hitting that. In your, it's just a way happier, easier window of pH to be applied to. I can't imagine, it's really rare a water source, well, and certainly municipal, that would come out with a pH that you'd have to be concerned about if you knew what you were doing on the organic soils growing. Right? I think you're 100% correct. Now, we have to watch what are the ppms made out of? What is that alkalinity? Is it high? Are we accumulating too many salts because of that municipal water or that well water? Did it have a high iron? We have seen iron levels really detrimental, and we have to do something about it. The rest of the water, absolutely perfect. But 15 parts per million iron. I mean, this is crazy. It really affects different things that, I mean, again, you're having to, there's a lot of things that if you're getting your media made for you based on your water chemistry, that's a thing, right? For larger production facilities, their media is being made for them based on my well water source, that's neat. We're matching. Oh, my well water's got this, so make me a blend that complements that.
Yeah.
But an organic, right? But in an organic, I mean, a wonderfully living soil, organic, water only media, I think we get away with a lot more, meaning it's a lot easier to do with various water chemistries. So I think that's super appropriate and a really, really wonderful way to grow, basically.
Yeah. And all that being said, though, I would still state that I believe pH of the water does matter, and it's something that we should be paying attention to on the water test. But what you brought up was a good point, is what's creating that pH is really the key to a lot of what we're looking at.
Exactly. Yeah. You have to know what's in the pH if you're injecting anything, even organics. If you're putting in an additive for that last couple of weeks, flour, if you're putting something extra in it, that pH, if it's acidic or if it's non-acidic, if it's neutral, how does it affect whatever you're adding? Because pH will make things more or less available and could alter their form. And you asked about acids and types of acid, right? Citric acid for organic growing.
That's my next question for you.
Yeah.
I thought it was a simple question asking you what are your favorite or best pH adjusters, and you looked at me and like that was a huge question. So let's talk about it.
If I gave you an answer, then 1,000 colleagues would be like, "What?" I mean, everybody has their own preference. Organic growers are sort of stuck with the citric acid, I think, is one of the only, or is there anything else out there? It's a super weak acid that sort of dissipates quickly. It's tough to utilize on large production facilities. We found this out firsthand from our large cannabis growers that were using citric acid. I mean, so it's a wonderful discussion. If we are in pure big scale commercial horticulture, it's buy it as most cost efficient to get to your doorstep as you possibly can. And that is typically, unfortunately, as high a percentage of phosphoric or sulfuric acid as is legal to purchase, 400 gallon, 270 gallon totes, or 400 gallon totes of as high percentage caustic danger, like it's a shame, right? But yeah. So depending on what you're trying to do, it can be a very expensive input for facilities. If they were trying to use a weak acid to take 8.0 to 5.8 at 1,000 gallons a minute, you've got to start with the most concentrated acid. So those are the two complete extremes, are the citric acid and its strength in compared to a high sulfuric or phosphoric, etc.
And one other factor for folks to consider is that all of these can potentially bring in heavy metals as well. So you need to make sure you have a clean source. And citric is just gets very expensive on scale, and it's not going to hold your pH for very long in a reservoir.
Correct. It is pH creep just waiting to happen. You've got to use that water quickly. You can't make up too much of a batch. You've got to make it, use it, make it, use it, and still test it when it's coming out of your dripper or your hose, just to make sure. Because we're going, if you've crept in that wrong direction and we're applying 8.0 pH water to it, like you were saying, it does matter. And it's certainly going to affect things over the life cycle of a crop. And the younger the crop, I like to think, the more susceptible the root systems before it's matched, right? Before we've matched the root zone mass with the production we're trying to do, it's critical. It's more critical the younger the crop is. When we first got our small little transplants or we've really got to pay attention to it, because that plant hasn't reached its full efficiency yet down there.
Well, let's talk about heavy metals. We talked a little bit off air about this. I am going to share with you my experience and story, and then I was hoping you could kind of expand on that. So I have a good friend who's growing medical in a state where they also have rec. He decided to test his product to see if it would pass his flower, and he found it came back high in arsenic. So it would have actually potentially failed for arsenic.
Mm-hmm.
And he's growing in living soils. He's reusing his media. He's in beds. And so he was sharing this data with me, and he was looking at it, and he was using things like soft rock phosphate, kelp meal, but being very conscious of that. And being that he's an engineer, he was looking at how much, what ppms of arsenic specifically was that adding to his overall load, his soil. And basically, the long story short was, he found that relative to his water source, which I think, first of all, he had to get it tested to a lower detection limit because his original test wasn't low enough. And this is municipal water that is perfectly safe to drink by EPA standards. You're drinking whatever that is, a gallon or two a day, totally safe levels of arsenic. But he was putting 40,000 gallons of that water through his grow room in a given cycle. And that 0.2 ppm of arsenic, let's say, very safe levels, was building up in the soil over time and actually contributing potentially way more sorry, someone was logging into my Zoom account. I'll cut this part out. That level of the level of heavy metals in that water, that level of arsenic, was actually contributing way more to the overall amount of arsenic being added to his soil than the soft rock phosphate or the kelp meal became rather insignificant from an arsenic load. And he tested this by testing his flower every cycle, and he set up an RO filter, and he found that the next cycle his arsenic levels had dropped in his final flower. So he was assuming this was working. And then his next test, the levels went up and he was totally stumped. He came back to me. He's like, oh, my whole theory is not working. I cannot figure this out. Well, 2 months later, he reaches out and tells me that he found out his plumber had put the filter in backwards. And then when he fixed the filter, he just flushed everything that was on the filters through into the beds. So essentially all that arsenic went right into the beds anyway, it sounds like. And he was right back where he was. Fast forward another year, so a few more cycles, and he's seeing levels significantly lowering every cycle in terms of the amount of arsenic in his flower. So it does seem to be working. It's this idea of can we reduce the amount of overall heavy metals coming in to a rate that's lower than what's going out in the plant, this hyperaccumulator in the case of cannabis. And I guess my big takeaway is that water is actually probably one of our biggest contributors of heavy metals. And we have to look at it at a very low detection limit, potentially much lower than what would be much lower for agricultural use than what would be safe for drinking use as humans. What are your thoughts on all of that?
All of that is a perfect story. And all of that represents what we have run across multiple times over the last few years and cannabis growers have really taught us, because of its hyperaccumulation, and testing the flower is the end all be all. It's been fascinating for us to watch how the smallest parts per million, like you said, I mean, it's exactly this story over and over again. It's all a question of where did it come from and how do I control it? So your friend's story is perfect, and it was coming in on the water source, and he just accumulated too many ounces or pounds over the crop cycle, especially in that soil bed that you reuse. Incredibly important to make sure we are watching what our soup is made out of, right? Even if it's completely safe to eat the soup, if I keep pouring soup, it's going to just and then the water, just imagine the water evapotranspiration, right? We're going to accumulate what all of those things that were in the soup, but the soup was fine to drink, but a gallon after gallon of soup, and we're going to just left with this pile of who knows what is it made out of? Yeah. So that's that water test, is you've got to make sure. I mentioned in a follow-up to your story of some of the highest level best growers that were, and again, don't mean to poo-poo RO permeate and to grow with pure permeate. Again, just really got to know what you're doing, but it is this hungry, aggressive water. Failed his first flower test in a state, and it was, I believe, barium. What? Barium, a heavy metal, right? How on earth? Zero barium in the original water source. It had been stripping off, the RO permeate had been stripping off I think it was a chromoly coating of old pump impellers. So the pumping mechanisms and this RO permeate had pulled this stuff, heavy metals, out of the pump, and it had accumulated so well in this super efficient hyperaccumulating cannabis plant that he failed. We figured that out the hard way, but it all worked out. Bought new pumps with appropriate, everything, and no problem. And so it's just, where did it come from? So I love that story, and the others that are just, yes, your water source water is super important, but is the system to, after that, let's take a look at the whole system too, and see what other potential contaminants could be introduced and why. It's pretty fascinating. Yeah, love it.
Very cool. Well, I really appreciate your time today. I learned a ton of things, and I hope we can stay in touch as you continue to learn more about chloramine and PFAS and heavy metals. I know this is a constantly evolving industry. We're still learning so much about water. That's really amazing to me. We haven't figured it all out yet. So
isn't it amazing? Like you said, it's just one thing to be comfortable in drinking water, but when we start growing plants, all of the different things we've discovered about water and how much we still don't know about its effects, on what we do as horticultural, as growers in our spaces. So it's just been a lot of fun. Thanks for reaching out.
That was Les Evans, and you are listening to the Cannabis Cultivation and Science podcast. If you like the podcast, please leave us a rating and review, and give us a follow on Instagram and YouTube. And don't forget, at KISS Organics, we have a wider range of products we offer on our website, ranging from soils, amendments, beneficial insects, soil test analysis, and consulting. Thanks for listening.